In the previous video, we talked about cultural relativism, specifically this idea that there's no such thing as objective moral truth. Now, if there is no such thing as objective moral truth, we saw there are some strange implications. For example, we can't compare societies. We can't say that one society is better or worse than another. So if we have a society that practices genocide and we compare that to a society that doesn't, we can't say that one is better or worse because there's no moral standard by which we can compare these things. Additionally, if there's no such thing as objective moral truth, it looks like there's no such thing as moral progress. There's no sense in which society is getting morally better. All we can say is that it's changing in certain ways. So some practices, like slavery, are no longer allowed today, but that's not a positive change if there's truly no such thing as objective moral truth. What this means then is that if you think moral progress is possible, if you think it's possible for a society to get morally better, then there has to be some sort of objective moral truth. There has to be a standard by which we compare the past society to the present one. And for the same reason, if you think that societies that practice genocide are bad for practicing genocide, then you're not a relativist. You're committed to this idea that there really is a standard of right and wrong, and societies that practice genocide really are bad. So if there really is such a thing as objective moral truth, we've got to ask the question of how should we live our lives? This brings us from the meta-ethical question of whether or not there is an objective moral truth to normative ethics, where we're talking about how should I live my life? What type of person should I be? So in trying to answer this question of how should we live our lives, what type of people should we be, in trying to answer that question, we're going to look at three different schools of thought. The three schools of thought are utilitarianism, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics. All three of these different moral theories are going to have something very important to say about how we should be living our lives. One other general observation here, it's worth pointing out that each school of thought has a distinct focus. So utilitarianism is going to focus heavily on consequences. The idea is going to be to live a morally good life, you're going to have to do things that bring about the right sorts of consequences. Deontological ethics is much more focused on rules and obligations. So it's not really about consequences, it's about if you want to live a morally good life, you have to obey the right rules. You have to live your life according to a certain set of rules, and if the consequences are good or bad, that doesn't really matter. Being morally good means obeying the right rules. Then virtue ethics doesn't really focus as much on consequences or actions, but focuses on people. When answering the question, how should I live my life, the virtue ethicist is going to say you ought to develop the right type of character. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about utilitarianism. I'm going to give a super brief overview of it. In the next video, I'll do deontological ethics, and then the video after that is virtue ethics. These videos are just giving a basic understanding of what each school of thought is about, but there's much more that can be said of any of the three. Additionally, the reason why I start a bioethics course off by talking about normative theory is because it helps students see how much these different theories impact decision-making and policy-making in medicine or in bioethics more generally. When we go into the bioethical literature, you can see here's the influence of utilitarianism, or here's the influence of deontological ethics. And this helps to expose why some people disagree at times, because some people might approach a particular issue from a utilitarian standpoint, whereas their opponents are thinking more in deontological terms. So by understanding these different schools of thought, you can see not only the influences, how these different schools of thought have influenced bioethics, but you can start to understand why different people disagree sometimes. And by talking about utilitarianism, deontological ethics, virtue ethics, it's going to give students the tools that they need to navigate through some really difficult ethical questions. So all that being said, let's get to utilitarianism. A classic formulation of utilitarianism comes from John Stuart Mill. So Mill is really going to be the focus of our discussion of utilitarianism. And at the core of Mill's theory is what we might call the principle of utility. So the principle of utility goes like this. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Now, if we can understand this principle, we can start to understand the core of Mill's utilitarianism. So let's break this principle down into smaller parts. First, when we're talking about happiness, happiness in our contemporary society is usually talked about as an emotion or as a way that you feel. That's not what Mill is talking about. For Mill, happiness is pleasure. When Mill is talking about acting in such a way as to promote happiness, he's saying act in such a way that promotes pleasure. If happiness is pleasure, the reverse of pleasure is pain. So the principle of utility is telling us act in such a way that you're promoting pleasure and act in such a way that you're reducing pain. Now another qualifier is needed right off the bat. When we're talking about pain and pleasure, Mill is not just talking about bodily pain and bodily pleasure. So he's not talking about just basic carnal sorts of pain and pleasure. He's talking about pleasure as just a whole category of things. So you might get pleasure from eating, from exercising, those sorts of bodily pleasures, but there's all sorts of other types as well. You have pleasure that is associated with friendship. You have pleasure that's associated with having a fulfilling career. So when Mill is talking about pleasure, he's not just talking about bodily pleasures, he's talking about all sorts of different types of pleasure, any sort of positive experience that adds value to your life. And in fact, Mill thought that bodily pleasures are the lowest type. So when it comes to the pleasure you get from eating your favorite food, for example, that's qualitatively much less important, much less valuable than the pleasures associated with friendship or the pleasures associated with intellectual pursuits. The pleasures associated with intellectual pursuits or relational pursuits, for Mill at least, are much higher, more valuable than bodily or carnal pleasures. So when we're talking about maximizing pleasure, it's not simply carnal pleasure, it's not simply bodily pleasure, it's all sorts of different kinds. And it's also important to point out that not all pleasures are on the same scale. Certain pleasures, like pleasures of friendship, are going to be much more valuable than pleasures associated with eating food that you love, for example. So just to recap, happiness is referring to pleasure. The reverse of happiness is pain. Pleasure is a huge category. It includes bodily pleasure, but also intellectual pleasures, pleasures associated with friendship, all those sorts of things, any positive experiences that add value to your life. You're supposed to maximize those and minimize pain. Pain might include bodily pain, but also things like isolation, loneliness, any sort of negative features that detract value from your life. You're supposed to minimize those. But we still have the question, I'm supposed to be maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for whom? For myself? So is every individual supposed to go out there and just think about themselves, maximize their own happiness, minimize their own unhappiness? And for Mill, the answer is no. In fact, you have to think about yourself as a disinterested observer would. That is, you have to take yourself out of the equation. You can't think of yourself as special or more important than anyone else. Every single individual counts equally. So my happiness is just as important as yours. Your happiness is just as important as your neighbor's. Every single individual counts equally. You can't pursue your own happiness with greater fervor than pursuing anyone else's happiness. What this means then is when Mill is telling us we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain, he's talking about for the greatest number of people. Every individual counts as one. The right actions are going to be those actions that bring about the most happiness, the most pleasure for the greatest number of people. So I'm just one person. If a particular action is very painful for me, but brings tons of happiness to everyone else, that seems like the right thing to do. I need to set myself aside. I need to put myself aside. I can't be selfish. And I have to try to promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, whether that includes me or not. So utilitarianism is very much not about the individual. It's about the group. It's about trying to do what's best for the entire group, for the entire society, or the entire group of people who are affected by a particular action. As soon as I start caring about my own happiness more than someone else's, I'm at risk of doing something wrong. So I can't prioritize myself. I can't even prioritize the happiness of my loved ones over strangers, Because again, every single person counts as one. So if I can help 5 strangers versus helping 3 of my loved ones, I should help the 5 strangers. It's all about doing whatever is best for the entire group. It's about maximizing happiness, minimizing unhappiness for the greatest number of people. So suppose, for example, you're in a crowded room and somebody accidentally sets off a grenade. So a grenade is about to explode. You have 2 options that you can pursue. One is you could safely escape the room. So you have the opportunity to escape. Nobody else has that opportunity. If you do that, then 5 people are going to be killed by the explosion and dozens of people are going to be injured by it. The second option, and we're pretending there's only 2, so the second option is you jump on the grenade. So you can jump on the grenade and absorb the blast. This is going to kill you, but everyone else in the room will remain unharmed. So we ask the question, what's the right thing to do here? We look at option 1, you could get away, but a lot of people are going to be hurt. Option 2, you're going to sacrifice your life, but it's going to save a lot of other people from being harmed. What's the right thing to do? The utilitarian is pretty clear. You have to maximize pleasure, maximize happiness for the greatest number of people, and minimize pain for the greatest number as well. So the right action here, it's very clear, is option 2. You should jump on the grenade, sacrifice yourself for the group. And in fact, if you chose option 1 and you ran out of the room to save yourself, the utilitarian says you're doing what's immoral. You're doing the wrong action because you're selfishly putting your own happiness above the happiness of everyone else in that room, and you're just one person. Your happiness counts just as much as anyone else. So the wrong action would be to leave and save yourself. The right action, morally speaking, is to sacrifice yourself for the group. Now, this might seem right so far. You might think, yeah, I can understand why someone would think, if I had the opportunity to sacrifice my life to save other people, that would be a morally good thing to do. That seems reasonable. But things start getting weird as we continue to look at other examples. So take this example. Suppose you're a world-famous surgeon. You happen to have 5 patients who are all dying of organ failure. So 1 needs a heart, 1 needs a lung, 2 need kidneys, and so on. All 5 of these people are going to die tomorrow if they don't get a transplant, and you have extremely good evidence that they're not going to get a transplant in time. So if nothing changes, these 5 people are almost certainly going to die tomorrow. Into your office comes a healthy patient for a routine surgery. And the healthy patient just happens to be a perfect tissue match for all 5 of these dying individuals. Now, what you could do is during the routine surgery on this healthy person, you could end their life, make it look like an accident, and then use their organs to save these other 5. Or you could perform the routine surgery on the healthy patient, they continue to live, but these other 5 people die tomorrow. So the question is, what do you do in this case? And what does the utilitarian say here? They say, you should maximize the happiness for the greatest number of people. So 5 is greater than 1. It seems like the morally right thing to do is to kill the healthy person, take their organs, and save 5 lives. 5 is a greater number than 1. You're promoting greater happiness for more people if you kill this healthy person. So that's the right thing to do. Now, this might be really unsettling. The idea that morality would require you to kill an innocent person, a healthy person, just to save 5 lives, strikes a lot of people as wrong. Like that type of action is morally wrong. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. But if we look at the principle of utility and read it just on the surface at least, it's telling us the right action is the action that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. If you think that it would be wrong to kill the healthy person and save 5 lives, if you think that's wrong, then it seems like you've got intuitions that conflict with utilitarianism. In other words, there are problems with utilitarianism that don't sit well with you. And this is actually a huge concern for utilitarianism, because if our focus is entirely on trying to do whatever's best for the group, that might involve doing terrible things to individual members of the group. So if you can get greater happiness for the entire group by sacrificing individuals, utilitarianism is telling us that's the right thing to do, but that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. The idea that we can just sacrifice innocent individuals for the greater good seems wrong. So if we look at utilitarianism, a criticism of it is that it can't say that any particular type of action is inherently wrong. So think about lying, cheating, stealing, killing. Utilitarianism can't say that any of those actions are inherently wrong, They're not just wrong in and of themselves. Whether they're right or wrong, it all depends on the consequences they bring about. So if by lying you can bring about better consequences, then lying is a good thing to do, at least in that situation. If you can cheat or steal and that brings about greater happiness for more people, that's the right thing to do. Utilitarians can't say that any particular type of action is immoral. So if you think that there really are certain types of actions, lying, cheating, stealing, killing, that are just wrong in and of themselves, regardless of consequences, then you're probably not a utilitarian. Or to put this concern a little bit differently, utilitarians, at least in the very basic classical form, seem to suggest that the end justifies the means. So if the end is good enough, if the consequences are good enough, then no matter what you have to do to get those consequences, it's fine. It's actually morally good. So if you can maximize happiness for the greatest number of people, it doesn't really matter how you do it, it just matters that you do it. This means that even if you could secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people by killing innocent people, if that's what you have to do to get the best consequences, then that's the right thing to do. So alternatively, if you think it's always wrong to kill innocent people, then it seems like utilitarianism probably isn't for you. Now this at least presents problems for classical utilitarianism, or a very basic form of utilitarianism. There are more sophisticated versions of the view that might avoid a lot of these problems. So the type of utilitarianism we've been talking about, focusing on the principle of utility, saying act in such a way as to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, that's kind of like accomplish the best consequences no matter what the means of doing so. That's what we might call act utilitarianism. So it focuses on which actions you should perform insofar as they bring about the best consequences. There's a different type of utilitarianism out there, though, called rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism tells us that we should try to generate a list of rules for our society that, when those rules are followed by everyone, tend to lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. One such rule might be never kill innocent people. If a society didn't operate according to that rule, and we allowed killing of innocent people all the time for whatever reason, then people are going to constantly live in fear, people are going to be paranoid, it's going to be a terrible situation. Whereas if our society adopts the rule, never kill innocent people, then in the long term, it seems like people are going to be happier, experiencing more pleasure and less pain than if we didn't have that rule. So by establishing a rule like don't kill innocent people, our society ends up being happier in the long run overall. And the same might hold for rules like don't tell lies, don't cheat, don't steal. It might be the case that if we have a society that obeys these rules, then in the long term, people are going to be happier overall than if we didn't have those rules. So again, the rule utilitarian is saying we're not focused so much on which actions bring about the best consequences, we're focused on which rules bring about the best consequences. By having our society obey a particular set of rules, we end up getting the best consequences in the long term. A concern for rule utilitarianism, though, is that sometimes by breaking a rule, you can bring about better consequences. So sometimes telling a lie might allow you to bring about better consequences than telling the truth. And so we've got this question of how rigid are these rules supposed to be? If we say that the end goal of morality is to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, it seems like our rules have to have some flexibility. There have to be exceptions to the rules. We might say, never tell lies unless you're sure that you can get away with it and that in doing so, it's going to bring about better consequences than telling the truth. That's a complicated rule, but it's a rule that we could live by. The problem is that this starts to collapse back into that classical form of utilitarianism, because we're essentially saying you should always obey the rules unless you can get away with it. Alternatively, if we always follow rules like don't kill innocent people, don't tell lies, don't cheat, don't steal, we might not actually be maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people. So by allowing exceptions to rules, we might be more effective at maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people. By not allowing exceptions to the rules, we're actually failing to maximize happiness. Because again, there will always be exceptions to rules, right? Where by breaking a particular rule, you might be able to bring about more happiness. So what this means is rule utilitarianism and the principle of utility might actually be in conflict with one another. And the principle of utility is supposed to be the central feature of utilitarianism. So we've got this question of, if rule utilitarianism is in conflict with the principle of utility, is rule utilitarianism even a form of utilitarianism anymore? Still though, rule utilitarianism helps us get out of the problem that was generated by that surgeon example. So the surgeon case, we said the surgeon could kill one patient to save 5. But if our society abides by a rule, don't kill innocent people, then the surgeon's going to say, look, I can't do that because I'd be breaking one of these foundational moral rules. And so by breaking that rule, maybe I could maximize happiness in the short term, but our society has these rules in place to try to maximize happiness for everyone in the long term. So rule utilitarianism can at least explain why the doctor should not kill the healthy patient to save 5 others. But whatever the case, just to recap the discussion of utilitarianism, we began with that question of how should we live our lives? So the normative question. Utilitarianism is one of 3 schools of thought that tries to answer that question. It tells us in the principle of utility, you should live your life in such a way that you're maximizing happiness and minimizing pain for the greatest number of people. So it gives us an answer to the question, how should I live my life? The classical version of utilitarianism, which we also call act utilitarianism, says that you should always act in such a way that you're promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number. If you go with that particular moral worldview, you can't say that killing innocent people is always wrong, because if killing an innocent person leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number, then that makes it right to kill an innocent person. The same thing goes for lying, cheating, and stealing. The act utilitarian can't say that any of these actions are inherently wrong. Whether they're right or wrong, it all depends on what consequences they bring about. So if lying gets the best consequences, then lying is the right thing to do. If telling the truth gets the best consequences, then you should tell the truth. But act utilitarianism is telling you, act in such a way as to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and whatever those actions are, the end is going to justify the means. So if you think that it's always wrong to lie, cheat, steal, or kill innocent people, if you think those are always wrong, you're probably not an act utilitarian. This leaves rule utilitarianism, which is a much more careful or subtle moral perspective. And rule utilitarianism challenges us to come up with a list of rules that, if all of society were to follow them, would lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number in the long run. And so rules might include things like we shouldn't kill innocent people, or we should always tell the truth, or we shouldn't steal from one another. A society that lives by those rules might have greater happiness for more people in the long run. And so then it's just a question about which are the right rules. A problem we saw there was if you don't build exceptions into the rules, cases where breaking a rule might actually bring about better consequences, then you're not actually maximizing happiness for the greatest number. And so it seems like rule utilitarianism and the principle of utility might actually be in conflict, because rule utilitarianism is saying obey these rules, and principle of utility is saying we should maximize happiness for the greatest number. And sometimes breaking rules leads to greater happiness. So there's complicated relationships between the principle of utility and rule utilitarianism, but the end point is just utilitarianism is very much focused on trying to bring about the best consequences, namely moral actions are those that promote greater happiness for the greatest number of people. This is a type of morality where the individual doesn't really count for a whole lot. They just count as one individual among others. You can't treat yourself as special or more important than anyone else. So when we're talking about social policies, political policies, whatever, we should be aiming to try to do what's good for the greatest number of people. To apply this to your own life, you might think, if I'm faced with a choice between eating at a fancy restaurant, which is really expensive, or taking that money and donating it to a charity where that same amount of money could be used to save lives or prevent all sorts of disease, the right thing to do here is to not act selfishly and go out to this expensive restaurant. It's to take that same money and put it towards trying to maximize other people's happiness. So utilitarianism takes our focus off of ourselves and says we should be acting, we should be using our resources in ways that help the greatest number of people, even if that means you have to make all sorts of sacrifices for yourself. So utilitarian's going to have all sorts of problems with spending money on fancy restaurants, fancy cars, whatever. You shouldn't be spending money on that. You should be spending your money on trying to reduce suffering or trying to promote the happiness of everyone else in your society or even in the world. So when we get into bioethical discussions about healthcare, for example, we might see utilitarianism as kind of influencing the view that society should be providing healthcare for everyone, trying to promote the health of everyone, even if that means individuals with a lot of wealth or resources have to sacrifice that. They don't have a moral right to hold on to those resources. Utilitarianism is telling them you should be spending your resources to try to help as many people as you can. That's what being a morally good person is about. But again, utilitarianism is just one of 3 different moral perspectives we're going to be looking at. The next one is deontological ethics. So if you thought that it's always wrong to kill an innocent person, it's always wrong to tell a lie, those sorts of views, deontological ethics might be the type of moral perspective that you sympathize with. But we're going to get to that in the next video. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, concerns about utilitarianism, let me know in the discussion board and I'll talk to you there.